Why would camera geeks care how good the camera is on a phone? If you own professional cameras and maybe even shot with a few that cost more than some cars, shouldn't any camera system in a phone be one of the least exciting things? For me, it's quite the opposite. This might not be medium format, but it's the only camera I can always whip out of my pocket and shoot within seconds. But that's the easy bit. What about all the things this can do that all the big cameras can't? Unlike last year's 11 Pro and Pro Max, which came with the same cameras, this 12 Pro Max has the best camera out of the entire iPhone 12 lineup, meaning it does have some upgrades over the smaller 12 Pro. However, all comparisons that I will be able to actually show in this review are going to be against my 11 Pro Max because I don't have any of the other iPhone 12s on hand, but leave a comment letting me know if you would be interested to see me pitch this against the other iPhone 12s maybe in a future video. Now at surface level, the 12 Pro Max might not sound like too big of an upgrade compared to last year's 11 Pro Max, which is what I thought as well, until I began working on this review. There's actually a lot of new stuff worth talking about on the camera system alone, such as the new main camera. The lens is now an f1.6, so theoretically speaking, a third of a stop brighter than last year's iPhones, but specifically on the 12 Pro Max, the main camera has a new, bigger sensor, but with the same resolution. As far as low light performance is concerned, that's already two pieces of good news. It is noticeable if you're taking photos under very dim lighting. The 12 Pro Max certainly looks more detailed, although I wouldn't say the margin is massive. But the moment we start comparing them using night mode, it actually closes the gap even more. I can't really say that the 12 Pro Max is the winner here, and to that I can only say that night mode is doing an excellent job. Since most people who have night mode at their disposal are going to use it when it's dark, it might not actually be that visible of a difference if we're talking resulting images. But where I really felt a quality of life upgrade as a result of that superior sensor was actually in the shooting experience. I was simply getting a better, clearer preview when shooting in really dark places. That bigger sensor also has another visible implication to how your images will look, and that is depth of field. This was taken with the main camera on the 12 Pro Max, and I was not using portrait mode. Because of that bigger sensor, the background naturally softens more significantly when you're focusing on close subjects. Not that this didn't happen with the 11 Pro Max, but the difference feels like it went from being barely noticeable to quite noticeable. If you're interested to know more about how sensor sizes eventually affect depth of field, I do have a video explaining just that. Feel free to check the description for that video. The main camera on the 12 Pro Max is also the first time we're seeing sensor shift image stabilization on any iPhone. Again, exclusive to the Max version, and just to clear the air of some confusion, it doesn't have sensor shift on top of OIS, it's replacing OIS on the main camera with sensor shift. Although, practically speaking, I didn't actually find sensor shift on the Pro Max to be better or worse than traditional OIS, it still does a great job, but since it appears about as effective, why bother changing things up, and on the Max version specifically? My take on that question is the Max has a larger sensor this time round, and while it may sound counterintuitive to try and physically stabilize a larger sensor, take into account that larger sensor also means larger, heavier lens to cover it. And in the case of the Pro Max, the engineers probably decided it was more efficient to stabilize the sensor rather than a chunk of optical elements. The telephoto camera, however, is using the more traditional OIS method, and since we've brought up the telephoto camera, it is now a 2.5x camera on the 12 Pro Max compared to just 2x on the 12 Pro and last year's Pro iPhones. Now, a 0.5x increase is probably not going to show you what's on the surface of the moon, but it's an increase that I do very much appreciate, especially for photographing human subjects. A 2x camera is roughly a 52mm equivalent lens. This 2.5x is about a 65mm, which is a far better portrait lens in my opinion because you can step back a little more when you're framing up on your subject, which results in less perspective distortion. It basically makes your subject look more proportionate. It's one of those subtle upgrades that one can probably live just fine without, but if you happen to have it, it's something you'll appreciate. But on the other side of the range, the ultra-wide has received a mix of both big and small upgrades. On the iPhone 11s, if you took an ultra-wide of a scene with a lot of straight lines, then the barrel distortion of the lens would be quite apparent. On the iPhone 12s, that is gone. Minor tweak, but if the distortion was something that bothered you a lot, this little update is going to make you very happy. Now, a more major upgrade would be something like being able to use night mode on the ultra-wide. That is probably one of the most significant upgrades on the iPhone 12s, but before we even go there, before we even start using night mode, the image quality out of the ultra-wide is already very visibly improved over the 11 Pro, particularly in medium light levels, because this now has deep fusion. In fact, on the iPhone 12s, all the cameras now have deep fusion as opposed to just the main camera on the iPhone 11s. So now there's deep fusion on the tele and the ultra-wide as well. Now, ultra-wide angle night mode. It was a feature I believe every iPhone 11 owner wanted really badly, and the reason for that is the ultra-wide angle simply suffered under low light. It had the darkest aperture, so it was one that could really benefit from having night mode, and it surely does right here. Now, if you compare it head-to-head with a night mode shot taken on the main camera, it's still going to look better on the main camera, so just setting expectations there, but night mode coming to the ultra-wide has definitely made the difference between taking an unusable shot in the dark versus a pretty good one. And I might be digressing a bit here, but night mode is something that still impresses me till this very moment, because the ability to take a detailed, low-noise photo in pitch dark using a series of long exposures handheld is unthinkable. It's one of those things I mentioned that none of the big professional cameras have been able to do yet. If you are a DSLR or mirrorless shooter and you want to take a long exposure photo in the dark, it's either you bring a tripod or you go home. I'd say if your shutter speed was anything longer than an eighth of a second, even if you're on a wide-ish angle lens, you can forget about hand holding it. So basically what night mode allows you to do is quite amazing. And instead of just popping out on the ultra-wide angle, night mode is now on the selfie camera as well. So no more flipping your phone around just so you could take a selfie using the rear camera, so you could use night mode. And when I said earlier that deep fusion is now on all cameras on the iPhone 12s, that includes the front camera as well. So good news is more detailed selfies, and bad news is, well, more detailed selfies. There's also a bit of an under the hood upgrade to portrait mode. It's now better at dealing with glass and transparent stuff in general. I thought I just got lucky with a few shots, but I was consistently getting good results with the 12 Pro Max where my 11 Pro Max would screw up. I thought for a moment it was the LiDAR giving the 12 Pro Max a hand with this, but it seemed to work similarly well even after I covered the LiDAR sensor with my finger. But a feature that is most certainly enabled by the LiDAR is night mode portraits. Typically in portrait mode, your iPhone, the iPhone 12 Pros included, uses the multi-camera array to generate the depth map. Depth map? Depth map. Notice how only in night portrait mode, the phone cannot process the background the moment I cover the LiDAR sensor. It would seem that in extreme low light, the software considers it better to render the portrait photo based off LiDAR information instead of optical information that may otherwise be less reliable when it's really dark. The LiDAR is also supposed to help out in terms of autofocus, so being a curious nerd, I sabotaged the LiDAR sensor again just to see how much of a difference not having a LiDAR makes. Honestly, I was kind of hoping to see the autofocus fail catastrophically, but in truth it barely did much to it. It was then I got the point that the LiDAR is really here to supplement the autofocus rather than drive it completely. And just for the record, the LiDAR is actually pretty much active the whole time you're shooting. Through an infrared camera, you can see it start projecting dots as soon as you launch the camera app, which I think looks way too cool. But still, being really curious people, we still want to see what improvement does it actually make. Here's a scenario where LiDAR made a visible difference for me. I was shooting video with the tele lens under indoor lighting and there's some relatively low contrast subjects. When I tried to focus between them, covering the LiDAR resulted in the AF hunting more aggressively, and when the LiDAR was left as it should, the focus was tracking in a much less jarring way with a lot less hunting. And here it is compared to the 11 Pro Max on the 2x lens just to show how much of an overall improvement there is. There is also one more exclusive feature coming to the 12 Pro models, and that is ProRAW. It's not available yet as of this video, but it does sound like a very useful feature for more serious photography on iPhone, so I'll very likely be making another video just covering ProRAW when it does come out, so make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that. Now let's talk about video. Pretty massive upgrade this time around. Right off the bat, there is a very noticeable improvement in low light video quality on the iPhone 12 Pro Max. It's visibly cleaner when compared to the 11 Pro Max, no surprise on the main camera really, but I was surprised to see a very noticeable improvement on the ultra-wide video as well. It's retaining details a lot better while everything looks overly smoothed out on the 11 Pro in comparison. It would seem to be the work of a far superior noise reduction process, which is something the ISP in the new A14 chip can probably take credit for, but I'm actually really fascinated by how visible of a difference it actually made. But now let's address the biggest upgrade to filming video on the iPhone 12's Dolby Vision HDR. Now, just in case anybody was confused by the terminology, Dolby Vision is a standard for mastering and playing back HDR content. It's a pretty sophisticated and high-quality standard, and by adhering to those standards, the iPhone 12s are now basically HDR content machines. To really summarize what HDR video is in layman terms, it just looks more like real life. When things are dark, you still see them, but you know it's dark. And when things are really bright, instead of just showing up as white on your screen, that part of the image is actually bright, like it throws more light at you. Traditionally speaking, making and showing HDR content is not easy because it requires a fair bit of resources. You would first need a camera capable of recording in HDR. You would then need an editing system that can handle and monitor in HDR so you could actually see what's going on. And finally, whoever's consuming that content needs a playback device that is capable of displaying HDR. That is a lot of equipment to invest in. And a single iPhone 12 also happens to be all of that. It can shoot, edit, and show HDR. This is a massive deal in my opinion because it's bringing HDR content creation into such accessible territory. And many but not all high-end cameras can shoot in an HDR format, but as far as my knowledge goes, none of them, not even the super expensive ones, have a built-in screen that is capable of monitoring in HDR. So you would always find yourself filming HDR while monitoring it in SDR. That is unless you plug in an external HDR monitor, and those things tend to cost quite a bit of money. So it was really a unique experience for me to be able to launch the camera on my daily smartphone and see a live HDR preview of whatever I'm filming. It's a pocketable HDR camera with a built-in HDR monitor. And when you shoot in HDR, it records in 10-bit instead of just 8-bit. There's a load of very expensive cameras out there that still cannot record 10-bit internally, and I know that a 2-bit increment might not sound like much, but if you are familiar with bit depths, you would know that it's actually a 4 times increase in brightness information per channel, which translates to 10-bit video being able to contain over 60 times more color variations than 8-bit, which is about 1.073 billion possible colors. Another thing is, when you record HDR on the iPhones, it records in the much wider Rec 2020 color gamut as opposed to the more typical Rec 709 if you were recording in SDR. And in case there's any super technical people who are watching and are really curious, the iPhone 12s record HDR using the HLG OETF. Also, everything we've talked about HDR so far applies to the front camera as well. Now, I would love to show some footage I shot on the iPhone 12 Pro Max in HDR, but I can't in this video because this is an SDR video. So I'll have a separate HDR video where I'll show some footage from the 12 Pro Max in HDR, but bear in mind YouTube doesn't support the Dolby Vision standard yet as of current, so it might look a little different here on YouTube compared to how it's supposed to look originally on the iPhone display, but I would say that's our best option for now. I'll leave a link to that in the description. So these cameras on the iPhone 12 Pro Max, despite them being the product of a gradual evolution, I still find it quite staggering how capable of an imaging machine we are carrying around in our pockets. I find it fascinating and even to some extent provoking to see how this is using computational photography to challenge the physical boundaries that are associated with small camera systems. Let me know down in the comments what you imagine the future of photography to be like. I'm genuinely curious. Also, if you've been watching this long, then you should probably check out some of my other videos as well.